Hello, my name is Chuck Fithian. I'm an historical archaeologist. My particular research interest is the archaeology of the 17th and 18th centuries, the early republic, and also maritime sites and military sites. My regional focus is the Mid-Atlantic. I have a particular interest in Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. For today's lecture, what I'd like to talk to you is a project that I've been working on for some time that seeks to look at the early colonial beginnings of the state of Delaware, specifically the 17th century. Today's focus we'll look at what colonial society was like within Kent County. This topic is pretty broad, but in the interest of time, we'll try to confine it to that. Let's take a quick overview of the region very, very briefly. The Delaware Valley is a part of the wider Mid-Atlantic. Along with the Chesapeake Bay that you see next to it, these areas were some of the areas that were colonized the earliest by Europeans in the late 16th and early part of the 17th century. These areas would be a focus of that endeavor. They would also be stages where national struggles, imperial struggles would play themselves out during the course of this period. The Delaware Valley, however, became one of the most diverse colonial areas within colonial America. Various different groups came to this region throughout the course of the period and settled and interacted with each other. Historians have long recognized the cultural diversity of this particular region. But for purpose of today, let's look at Delaware and how it fit into it. It was very clearly a part of it, both geographically, but also culturally and in terms of the overall settlement period. The process of colonization brought together and integrated people from widely divergent backgrounds. You have American Indians here first, obviously. Their cultures were complex, and they were also very old. Many of these cultures had been here for thousands of years prior to when the Europeans arrived. But during the course of the 17th century, Dutch settlers would come to the area, Swedish settlers would come to the area. They would also bring Finnish settlers. You would have these two groups vying for control of the area. Beginning in the 1660s, the English would take an interest in colonization. So Englishmen of widely differing backgrounds, English culture is not homogeneous. They would also arrive along with Welsh, Scots, and Irish. Along with this would also be Africans. We have some of the earliest evidence for African presence as early as the 1620s. That were here in the Delaware Valley. So you would have all of these groups interacting that would come from widely divergent national backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds. Most notably would be the Quakers who would settle in this region. So the idea that this was the most culturally diverse area within colonial America is really not an exaggeration. In spite of that diversity and the interest that should have, the story in Delaware has not received that much scholarly attention. And there's a couple of reasons for it. First, Delaware scholarship has tended to focus on the American Revolution and Delaware's prominent role in that and the constitutional era. Another reason, though, is the assumption has been among some of the early researchers that looked at Delaware that Delaware was simply a shadow of the Chesapeake or southeastern Pennsylvania. That really, in spite of this diversity, didn't have a unique identity. And as we started this project, we began to think, well, how can that be if we have all of this, these diverse groups, coming in here? How can it be that? How can it be that simple? So what we did, we wanted to take a look, start this project to begin to really examine that critically, and to kind of start anew and use different lines of evidence to look at Delaware society, with the questions being, was it indeed simply an extension of the Chesapeake or southeastern Pennsylvania, or perhaps that it had a tenor of its own, that the settlers in this area produced a culture that was distinct. Yes, probably having connections to these other areas, but yet had a distinct pattern and tenor of its own. Now how do we go about doing that? One of the first lines of evidence that we wanted to use was archaeological data. Delaware is fortunate to have an extensive amount of archaeological data already extant in the state's collections. So we wanted to begin there. We thought we already have this information, so let's use that as a starting point. Because we had so many unknowns here, we thought, well, if we just started out excavating, all that might tell us is what we already knew. So let's use existing data and then use that as a springboard to use new data. So what we did, we integrated information from collections. This is initially a collections-based project. And then as new sites were discovered through highway projects and state projects, government projects, things like that, then we could pull that information in to see how it compares to information that we already had and patterns that we think we were already seeing. We wanted to take that information and combine it to a documentary and historical record. Now, the way we wanted to do this was we wanted each of these lines of information to be separate but co-equal. Now, what does that mean? What we wanted to do was not take one set of information from one and make it fit into the other. That sort of becomes self-confirming, and we sort of find exactly what we're looking for. So we wanted them to exist as separate lines of evidence to see how they were similar, but yet to see how they might be different. How might these two pieces of data were confirming what we saw or challenging our notions? We felt that through that process, we would arrive at the perspective that we should have. Delaware is very fortunate to have a very extensive documentary database as well. Despite the fact that the state lost a lot of its records during the American Revolution, Delaware has some very singular records that relate to the 17th and early part of the 18th century. The methodological framework, or theoretical framework, for this is to take that information but to look at it from the perspective of how human culture, the anthropological side of this, interacts with the natural environment. Our perspective is that the natural environment influences many aspects of culture, and you see several here. Things such as settlement patterns, technology, the biosocial environment, in other words, how people are interacting with each other, what we eat, subsistence, and our religion and mythologies all have connections to the natural world. The thing that we wanted to avoid, though, is the slipping into a form of determinism that made that the only force for change and only force for adaptation. We knew that would not necessarily be the case, but we also felt that it was an important one and a pretty big one that still really influences us today. If you think about it, if you think about some of the issues of environmental issues, that we face today. Okay, let's start with settlement pattern. How people interact with the natural landscape is one of the most basic and fundamental adaptations and changes that they have to make. So in the case of the Europeans, they are arriving into an area that was really foreign to them. It didn't look at all like the homelands did. So they're having to make decisions and changes and alterations to their cultural patterns that they took sort of for granted in a sense. They had to change them to meet new conditions. So to effort to understand how they did that, what sort of the decisions were behind that process, we looked at several key variables. Distance from Delaware Bay, site elevation, high above sea level, soil association, meaning what types of soil that these sites are associated in. The reason for that is to look at agricultural production. Are these sites in marginal areas? Are these sites in highly productive areas? Presence of potable water, are there wells? Are they getting drinking water from someplace else? Distance to another body of navigable water, and nearest neighbor. So those are the few that we selected as key variables that would influence settlement pattern. Now, as we move through the project, we initially started out with having very few sites that we knew about. So this is where the use of collections that are curated in repositories become very important, because those are the kinds of information that we're going to go to look at. And what we discovered as we began to look through this, we actually had far more sites than the handful that we thought we had. And as this project evolved for Kent County, at this point we had no less than 85 sites. That site is now the number has now increased, but 85 was a pretty robust number, far and above what we were anticipating to see. But what you see in this image is the red dots indicate site locations. And by looking at those very closely, we are able to answer those questions. So in other words, distance to water would be from this location down to the St. Jones River itself or a drainage that it seems to be associated with. There's a site that's situated here with a smaller drainage. Here's a site that seems to have no drainage association at all. And we're going, what's going on with that? You know, that's kind of interesting because our assumption is that they would automatically seat themselves by the water. Perhaps not. And it was something that we needed to look at. What's the orientation to Delaware Bay? Is there an orientation? And we derived those questions from colleagues who had asked similar questions of Chesapeake sites. And we thought, all right, well, if the party line is that, well, it's just going to look like the Chesapeake, then we should be seeing a Chesapeake pattern here if that is indeed the case. So in looking at the sites, here's what we began to see. Many sites in the Chesapeake are oriented to the Chesapeake Bay itself. We looked at sites related to Delaware Bay, and did not find a single one. So almost like right out, kind of right out from the start, we're starting to see some variations. Many of our sites are along the drainage systems, usually situated on headlands that you see in the back, here, usually with a fairly broad marsh frontage. Distances to water in the Chesapeake, a very common dimension for a 17th century site, is about 500 feet. We began to look at some of that distance, and we did not find many with 500 feet. We found some, but we found many with 1,200 feet, 1,300 feet, 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet. We're saying, wow, what's happening? What's happening with this? This is really not if the earlier premise is true, we should not be seeing that. So the majority of our sites were in settings, like this along major river drainages. Other ones, however, were along smaller ones. For example, you would see them situated here on this little point of land or right in here. Those are very ecologically optimal areas. They're very rich and very abundant. A lot of Native Americans occupied those sites. Europeans obviously saw the value in that as well. This is Tidbury Branch, this small tributary that you see here flowing out to the St. John's River. And to give you a point of reference, the town of Dover is over this way. This is an edge of the Dover Air Force Base. That should give you an idea geographically where some of these sites are located. Other sites are even at smaller drainages, such as this one, which is probably never navigable in this period. Certainly is not now. So again, we're starting to see some variation, that existed in terms of site location. But probably some of the most surprising ones are ones that are in upland riparian settings. There's a site just a short distance away. This is Punch and Run, a tributary of the St. John's. It meanders back, and this is right on the southwestern edge of the city of Dover. And across the road, back in this wooded area, was a site dating to the period that we're investigating. And again, we were somewhat surprised to see that. We were expecting to see these sites maybe further down the drainages, closer to the marshes, the saltwater interface, the Delaware Bay, kind of the Delaware Bay itself. So we're starting to see, a very different pattern emerging in these site locations. In some of these sites, in interior locations, got even more interior than we were expecting. Such as this site here, on this little knoll here, you have the Choptank River that kind of meanders through. Here's Caroline County, Maryland, and Kent County, Delaware. There was a site situated here. We think there was one over here, but unfortunately, it was destroyed by the borrow pitting, the sand mining that took place. So with all this together, we were starting to see a very different pattern emerge. Now, what about soil? And this is where there's a closer comparison to the Chesapeake, but it also has some important implications. Well, almost without exception, every one of these sites that we were looking at had a very close connection to the presence of Mattapique and sassafras soil series. These are very agriculturally productive. They will grow just about anything. The close correlation with site location and this soil is particularly important for the emergence of agriculture that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But it also indicates that these people, in picking this site, recognize the qualities of soil. Even though they were in an area they were unfamiliar with, they had perhaps a folk process, something like that, that allowed them to recognize the qualities of the soil and to recognize their productivity, and therefore select that area as a site to create their plantation and things like that. So here's the similarity between the two regions. We're seeing a very divergent pattern in terms of where sites are across the landscape, but a very similar pattern to the Chesapeake in terms of the specifics of something at the site itself, particularly as it relates to soil. Another unusual development was that most cases, particularly the archaeological sites that were excavated fully, had a well. And that contrasts very sharply to Chesapeake sites at this period, which do not. Some here and there do. It's not a stark either or situation. But for the most part, plantation sites in the Chesapeake are oriented towards springs. These are areas where water sort of naturally bubbles up. It's very clean, potable, drinkable water. Springs do exist across the Delaware landscape in Kent County, but we are finding that as we look at the sites and look at their setting, most of them had a well. So here's a very divergent pattern. These are very costly to do, somewhat dangerous, dangerous to excavate. This will give you an idea of what one of those wells look like. They most likely would have had a lining. The archaeologist is sitting on a ladder because this well started working during the course of the excavation. That's actually water at his feet. Chances are further down would have been wooden cribbing intact. Sometimes they would use barrels stacked on top of each other. Sometimes they would use those two things in combination or other arrangements. But wells were extremely important to colonial Delawareans as they began to occupy and develop their plantations. So what do we see? How does this compare to the Chesapeake? First, we see varied site locations, far more varied than in some of the other areas. That colonial Delawareans distributed themselves across the land. They were able to take advantage of lowland settings along the marshes. They were able to take advantage of settings with much higher elevation up in the riparian settings that you see. Some are further down on the drainages. Some have no orientation to a drainage at all. Some are very interior, such as the areas that we were just discussing, between the border of Kent County, Delaware, and Caroline County, Maryland. Distance to water is frequently greater in Chesapeake. As I indicated, a lot of Chesapeake sites are about 500 feet or so. We found a few of those, but by and large, those distances from the site to the body of water itself is much greater. Sometimes by double, sometimes by three times that, sometimes four times that, depending. Water orientation appears to be less. As I indicated, some of these sites have no water orientation at all. And quite how they fitted into this, we're not really sure. There is a close association with very highly productive agricultural soils, and wells are present. So in other words, the model that early researchers had developed that looked at Delaware sites in terms of them reflecting Chesapeake patterns really doesn't work particularly well. That it looks like in terms of settlement systems, settlement patterns, site locations, colonial Delawareans were far more diverse, far more adaptable than their neighbors just a short distance away in the Chesapeake and neighboring Pennsylvania. So again, almost at the outset, just looking at this variable alone, we are seeing that colonial Delaware society was beginning to exhibit some patterns that set itself as somewhat distinct. Now, what might cause some of these distances between the site and the water to become so great? And what we began to look at was the presence of marshes, because most of these sites are on the fast land in back of a marsh. And so we were asking, were these marshes here at the time, or have these marshes developed and therefore is skewing how we're looking at the landscape? The other related question to that, are there 17th century sites buried under the marshes? So our settlement pattern ideas are totally wrong. We're just seeing only the back rear portions of that. So we talked to geologists, we talked to specialists in marsh ecology and things like that. And what we began to see is that no, there's not enough time for 17th century sites to be buried under a marsh. So that our patterns that we're seeing on the fast land and back of them is indeed correct. So the next thing that we got into looking at was, okay, the role of marshes then had a very profound effect on settlement. It created, in essence, as you see here, kind of a rind, around these areas that colonists into the area had to deal with. So because these marshes look very different in Delaware than they do in the Chesapeake. It's not like Delaware has marshes and the Chesapeake doesn't. Both areas do, but geologically, morphologically, they're different. And the ones in Delaware create this sort of barrier that served to, in effect, cause Delawareans to have to move further away. And they did not enjoy that luxury of having the water at such close proximity to their home or to their plantation. So this, by deriving at this, we were able to look at land records, and we looked at percentages and acreages of marshes. And they were enormous. We also looked at some early maps. For example, this map of the St. John's River dates to the 1850s, but if our ideas are right, it should give us an idea of what these marshes looked like a little bit earlier. And so what we were able to see is that these river systems are relatively stable, and these marsh ecosystems were present in sizable numbers. So the sizes of the marshes, the distances that we're seeing correlate very well together, causing this settlement pattern to become different. Another variable in this is, okay, if they can't get to the water, then how were they able to do it? If they had these rinds kind of running, marsh rinds running around the edges, how did they do that? And what we began, as we went back into some of the land records, we began to notice something that was particularly important to how they described the land and how colonists selected it. And that was the location of a river landing. They're still with us today. Many of you may be familiar with them, these places that you see. And what they are, these are fast, projections of fast land that actually extend through the marsh system and are bordered by the water itself. These are not common. They're not all over the place. Some of them, we can still see. Some of them have probably gone due to ecological change. But they served, in effect, one, to create a different settlement system, because many colonists tied their plantation to that, whereas a lot of their Chesapeake neighbors were not necessarily doing that because they had more direct water access. So Delaware colonists tried to gain access to these locations. That, in effect, created a very different transportation and economic system. Chesapeake colonists, because of their proximity to the water, a ship could pull up outside, say a Dutch ship that was a Dutch trading vessel. They could bring their produce, their tobacco down, or whatever it was they were growing, make the trades with the Dutch merchants that were aboard, or the Dutch captains who were aboard, and do it fairly simply. Delawareans did not have that luxury, so they had to develop a watercraft to be able to exploit and utilize these landing areas. And one of those watercraft, which is very deep in European maritime tradition, was the shallop. These were very shallow draft vessels that were ideally suited to scooting around in the river systems and being able to go out into broader open water, such as you would find on Delaware Bay and even probably the Atlantic, the Atlantic Ocean coastal areas itself. There's also another interesting side to this. The river landings began to establish affect social relations between individual colonists, particularly those that had a landing and those that didn't. And there's a very interesting court case that a planter, was taken to the Kent County Court and sued by his neighbor because he denied his neighbor the privilege of his landing, as he referred to it. So in other words, the one man on the one hand who brought the suit felt that his neighbor had a social obligation to let him use his landing because he did not have one. So this is a really interesting aspect of where the natural environment is beginning to influence how humans interact with each other. It had a very distinct social connection to it. The way the local government got around this problem was the establishment of public landings, which is really interesting. These are a very early sort of make-works project. They started in the 1690s, and actually is land that was acquired by the county government from planters, and this had a landing on it, and they established that as a public landing in which everyone would be able to use it and access it. Should you not have one on your own land? So really interesting developments in terms of economic pattern, which is very different what's going on in the Chesapeake, but also how the natural environment began to establish social parameters, and it began to influence how planters interacted with each other. Another part of that, sort of the kind of the hand that fits that fits inside the glove, is the role of roads. As we began to look at the historical record, we found lots of reference to these. Roads were going to different places. You would see a reference to it connects the people of the forest to John Jones's plantation, just to give you an example, or roads that would connect other more established plantations together, and we began to kind of look at this and wow, there's really a lot of effort here. There's a lot of smaller roads that are being developed. The county very early establishes overseers of highways. These are men who were charged to kind of go out and make sure that road gets created, and it's also kept clean. With vegetation would try to colonize back over it. Their job was to make sure that didn't happen. Here's probably one of the earliest road subscriptions that Delaware has. There's a number of those preserved in the archives, but this has to be one of the earliest ones, and it's really a small entry that's buried in the middle of a Kent County land record here at the archives. And what it is a group of planters that you see listed here got together and contributed certain amounts of tobacco. You'll see quantities of 200 pounds, 400 pounds, 100, depending on what you'd have. And the purpose of this was to develop a road to Chester and to the chop tank. And what's so fascinating about this is that this is not local roads connecting plantations. This is roads connecting planters on the Delaware to areas in the Chesapeake. So really early on, they are creating these connections that reach and connect these two very different, very different colonial areas. So this is a process, a type of undertaking that we did not know that they were doing. The party line had been that people just sort of got around by little boats and scooted around that way, of which they did. There was a certain element of truth to that, but it's not the only way. And as we began to look at the archaeological collections, horse equipment shows up in nearly just about every one of them, which again is an interesting contrast to a comparable period in Chesapeake colonization where horses are very scarce and this kind of artifact does not show up. This is a buckle, and these are various kinds of harness or bits, bits that connect to the horse itself. So what we're seeing is a very complicated sort of lattice work of land-based roads, river landings that begin to connect the Chesapeake and Delaware Bay regions. So this is really a far more complex sort of network than we were expecting to see. It's one thing to have smaller roads that kind of connect local places, but this is really far-reaching, and it has implications for some things that we'll talk about in a few moments. A little bit later on. So one of the mantras, so to speak, that everybody got around by boats and land-based transportation developed much later. Probably not so. That we're finding this really complex system long prior to 1725. Now, what about economy? What about agriculture? One of the surprises that we had was the frequent mentioning of tobacco, and the more that we looked at it, more and more of it, that we saw. Again, a previous interpretation had looked at that really didn't play much of a role, that Delaware planters went to growing wheat and other grains. So, but the more we looked at the 1680s, the 1670s, 1680s, 1690s, there was lots of tobacco being grown. And Delaware is not normally thought of as being a part of the tobacco coast like Maryland and Virginia is. But our research indicate that's really not the case, that it really was indeed a part of that. We got a glimpse of this by being able to reconstruct tobacco crop sizes. There were two of them that we were able to do that. Fortunately, the court records for Wilson in 1698 allowed us to estimate his crop size based on the barrels that he had made. The tobacco hogshead, the barrel that it went in, was set by colonial law. So it had to have a certain capacity. So by knowing that, we could kind of figure out how many how many plants he had and how big his crop would be. Likewise with William Rodney, right at the beginning of the 18th century. Now his is a little bit less because he kept some for his own personal use, but it was a very comparable. These amounts that are being grown are very comparable to what Chesapeake planters are growing at the same time. So here's, at this stage of development of colonial society, tobacco was extraordinarily important. Delawareans were growing it with the equal vigor that their neighbors in the Chesapeake were doing. We have some estimates from documents that was sent back to the British government in the late 17th century, kind of talking about the agricultural production of the lower counties on Delaware, as Delaware was known at the time, and it was in the millions of pounds of tobacco that was coming out of the Delaware, or coming off of out of the lower counties and going to markets largely in Great Britain at the time. Another surprise was the role of cattle herding. We began to see references, particularly in the legal cases, court records, in other words, of references to cattle being lost on drives to meadows up around Philadelphia. There were certain individuals who were gathering up, large numbers of cattle, and they were being driven up the roads to meadows outside of the city of Philadelphia. As Penn's colony began to emerge and therefore create a market and a demand, these cattle were being driven up, for market and use in the city. So we see numerous references to herding and the loss of the cattle and trying to get them back, and the accumulation of herds of like several score of heads at a single time. What also makes this interesting is that we're running into references to South Carolinians who are doing the same thing. They are driving their cattle all the way up from South Carolina, or the colonial settlements there, to Philadelphia as well. So here you have Delaware planters and you have South Carolina planters starting to mingle together, and you kind of wonder how those conversations went, from time to time. So when we look at it all together, we see tobacco culture was pretty important. We do see early grain production. So it's true in the sense that Delawareans cultivated wheat and various other grains, but it was part of a larger agricultural pattern. It wasn't the pattern like we thought in the past. To that was added cattle herding, and we also began to run into commercial plantations. And what they are is plantations that were owned strictly for commercial interest. So in other words, this is not a family who got their land and went out and set up basically a homestead, a plantation of their own that they would function for their own purposes. This instead was a plantation that had an economic driver. They were to produce orchard products. They were to produce a particular kind of crop. They were to manage animal herds. They were to grow the orchards, things like that. And that is all. And we actually began to find like contract arrangements where the occupants would occupy the plantation for a period of years, usually 4 to 7 years, something like that. And that would be the end of it. And they would grow these products. They would take it to market. They would take care of the property for the owner, who was usually somewhere else. Probably the most unusual commercial plantation that we ran into dates right at the beginning of the 18th century, and it is the one that was to grow nothing but hemp. They were making rope for the Royal Navy. This crop would be harvested. It would be sent to the rope works in Britain for use on Royal Navy warships. So what does it all point to? It suggests that unlike their Chesapeake counterparts who were focused almost exclusively on tobacco for most of this period, Delaware planters took a different path. Yes, they grew tobacco with an equal vigor, but they also added grain. They also added cattle herding. They had these some had these commercial plantations. This sort of mixture of herding is something along the lines of a traditional English style mixed agriculture and husbandry. The American part of it is tobacco and these commercial plantations. But this mixture is very akin to English cultural practices, where you have an agricultural production and animal husbandry kind of mixed together. So probably a better way to put it, it's sort of a modified English-style mixed agriculture and husbandry type of system. With that, that concludes the first part of this lecture. That we examine settlement pattern, economy, agriculture, transportation. The next section will look at the area's social history and as that relates to material culture and architecture.